Story 1. At the airport. John arrives at the airport early. He wants to be calm and ready. He checks his bag and looks around. He sees many people walking. Some people talk quietly. Some people drink coffee. John goes to the check-in desk. The woman smiles and says, "Good morning." John smiles and says, "Good morning." She asks, "Where are you flying today?" John says, "I am flying to London." She asks for his passport. He gives it to her. She types on the computer. She gives him his boarding pass. She says, "Your gate is 23B. John says, "Thank you very much." He walks slowly to security. He feels calm and relaxed. Story 2. Waiting for the plane. John sits near his gate. He puts his bag next to him. He looks at his phone. He sees the time. He has enough time. He feels relaxed. A man sits next to him. The man smiles and says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." They talk quietly. The man asks, "Is this your first time flying to London?" John says, "No, but I am still excited." They both smile. They sit quietly again. Story 3. On the plane. John finds his seat. He puts his bag under the seat. He sits down and relaxes. The flight attendant comes. She smiles and says, "Welcome." John smiles back. She asks, "Would you like water or juice?" John says, "Water, please." She gives him a cup of water. He says, "Thank you." The plane starts moving slowly. John looks out the window. He sees the runway and the sky. He feels calm. He feels safe. Story 4. During the flight. The plane is in the sky. John looks at the clouds. They look soft and white. He listens to quiet music. He closes his eyes for a moment. He takes a deep breath. A man behind him is reading. A woman in front of him is sleeping. The plane is calm. John thinks about his trip. He thinks about new places. He feels peaceful. Story 5. Arriving in London. The plane lands smoothly. John feels happy. He stands up slowly. He takes his bag. He follows the signs. He goes to passport control. A man checks his passport. He smiles and says, "Welcome." John says, "Thank you." John walks to get his luggage. He finds his bag. He feels relieved. Story 6. At the taxi stand. John walks outside the airport. He feels fresh air on his face. He sees taxis waiting. He goes to one taxi. The driver smiles and says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." The driver asks, "Where do you want to go?" John says, "To my hotel, please." They start driving. John looks out the window. He sees the city. Story 7. At the hotel reception. The hotel is quiet and clean. John walks to the front desk. A man smiles and says, "Good evening." John says, "Good evening." The man asks, "Do you have a reservation?" John says, "Yes, my name is John." The man checks the computer. He smiles and gives John a key. He says, "Your room is on the 3rd floor." John says, "Thank you very much." Story 8. In the hotel room. John enters his room. The room is comfortable and quiet. He puts his bag on the floor. He sits on the bed. He takes a deep breath. He opens the window. He sees the city lights. He feels calm and happy. He lies down. He rests. He feels safe. Story 9. At the cafe in the morning. In the morning, John goes to a cafe. The cafe is warm and smells good. A woman smiles and says, "Good morning." John says, "Good morning." She asks, "What would you like to drink?" John says, "I would like a coffee, please." She asks, "Would you like something to eat?" John says, "Yes, a sandwich, please." He sits at a table. He waits quietly. Story 10. Enjoying breakfast. The woman brings his coffee and sandwich. John says, "Thank you." He drinks his coffee slowly. He eats his sandwich. He looks around the cafe. People talk softly. Soft music plays. John feels calm. He feels ready for the day. Story 11. Walking in the city. After breakfast, John walks in the city. The streets are busy but calm. He sees shops and people. He hears cars and buses. He walks slowly. He enjoys the walk. He stops at a small park. He sits on a bench. He rests. Story 12. At the park. The park is green and peaceful. Birds sing in the trees. John walks on a path. He breathes deeply. He feels relaxed. He sees children playing. He sees people walking dogs. He smiles. He feels happy. Story 13. At the store. John goes into a store. He wants to buy some water and fruit. A woman smiles and says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." He takes a bottle of water. He takes some apples. He goes to the cashier. She says, "That will be £5." John pays and says, "Thank you." Story 14. At the museum. John visits a museum. The museum is quiet and cool. He walks slowly. He looks at paintings. He reads the signs. He learns new things. He feels interested. He sits on a bench. He rests. He feels calm. Story 15. At the river. John walks near a river. The water moves slowly. He stands and looks at the water. He listens to the sound. He takes a deep breath. He feels peaceful. He sits on a bench. He rests quietly. Story 16. At the restaurant. In the evening, John goes to a restaurant. The restaurant is warm and quiet. A waiter smiles and says, "Good evening." John says, "Good evening." The waiter asks, "Are you ready to order?" John says, "Yes." He says, "I would like chicken with rice, please." The waiter says, "Of course." John waits quietly. Story 17. Eating dinner. The waiter brings the food. John says, "Thank you." He eats slowly. He enjoys the taste. He drinks water. He feels relaxed. He looks around. People talk quietly. Soft music plays. Story 18. Walking back to the hotel. After dinner, John walks back to his hotel. The street lights are soft. He walks slowly. He feels calm. He looks at the sky. He sees stars. He smiles. Story 19. At the hotel at night. John enters his hotel room. The room is quiet and warm. He changes his clothes. He washes his face. He lies on the bed. He closes his eyes. He breathes slowly. He feels relaxed. He sleeps. Story 20. The next morning, John wakes up feeling rested. The sun is shining softly. He sits up. He stretches. He smiles. He feels calm. He feels ready for a new day. Story 21. Morning walk. John wakes up early. He feels fresh and calm. He puts on his jacket. He goes outside. The air is cool. The street is quiet. He walks slowly. He looks at the houses. He looks at the trees. He breathes deeply. He feels relaxed. Story 22. At the bakery. John goes to a bakery. The bakery smells very good. A woman smiles and says, "Good morning." John says, "Good morning." She asks, "What would you like?" John says, "I would like some bread and a cake, please." She gives him the food. John says, "Thank you." He leaves the bakery. He feels happy. Story 23. On the street. John walks down the street. People walk to work. Cars drive slowly. He sees a man walking his dog. He sees a woman talking on the phone. John feels calm. He enjoys the morning. Story 24. At the bank. John goes to the bank. The bank is clean and quiet. A woman smiles and says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." She asks, "How can I help you?" John says, "I would like to change some money." She helps him. She gives him the money. John says, "Thank you." He feels relaxed. Story 25. At the post office. John goes to the post office. The post office is calm. A man behind the desk says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." He says, "I would like to send this letter." The man takes the letter and stamps it. He says, "Here you are." John says, "Thank you." Story 26. At the library. John goes to the library. The library is very quiet. He walks between the shelves. He looks at the books. He finds an easy book. He sits and reads. He turns the pages slowly. He feels calm. Story 27. At the gym. John goes to the gym. The gym is not very busy. He walks on the treadmill. He stretches his arms. He drinks water. He rests. He feels strong. He feels relaxed. Story 28. At the swimming pool. John goes to the swimming pool. The pool is clean and quiet. He sits near the pool. He puts his feet in the water. The water is cool. He feels refreshed. He smiles. He feels calm. Story 29. At the playground. John walks near a playground. Children are playing. He hears laughter. He sees children running. He sits on a bench. He watches. He feels happy. Story 30. At the flower shop. John goes into a flower shop. The shop is colorful. A woman smiles and says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." He buys some flowers. He says, "Thank you." He leaves the shop. He feels good. Story 31. At the book club. John goes to a book club. People sit in a circle. They read together. They talk quietly. John listens. He smiles. He feels calm. Story 32. At the cinema. John goes to the cinema. The room is dark and quiet. He sits down. He watches the movie. He feels relaxed. He enjoys the story. Story 33, at the coffee shop again. John goes to a coffee shop. The shop is warm. The music is soft. A man smiles and says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." He orders tea. He sits quietly. He drinks slowly. He feels calm. Story 34. On the bus. John takes a bus. The bus is not full. He sits by the window. He looks outside. He sees buildings. He sees trees. He feels relaxed. He feels calm. Story 35. At the park in the evening. John goes to the park in the evening. The sun is low. He walks slowly. He sits on a bench. He watches the sky. He feels peaceful. Story 36. At the lake. John walks near a lake. The water is still. He sits near the water. He listens to the sounds. He breathes deeply. He feels calm. Story 37. At the bridge. John walks across a bridge. The water moves slowly. He stops. He looks down. He smiles. He feels relaxed. Story 38. At the town square. John goes to the town square. People walk slowly. He sits on a bench. He watches. He feels calm. He feels peaceful. Story 39. At the evening market. John goes to an evening market. The lights are soft. He walks slowly. He looks at food. He smells the air. He feels happy. Story 40. At the music store. John goes to a music store. Music plays softly. He listens. He smiles. He feels relaxed. Story 41. At the art class. John joins an art class. People draw quietly. He draws a picture. He feels calm. Story 42. At the yoga class. John goes to a yoga class. The room is quiet. He moves slowly. He breathes deeply. He feels relaxed. He feels peaceful. Story 43. At the tea house. John goes to a tea house. The room is warm. A woman smiles and says, "Hello." John says, "Hello." He drinks tea slowly. He feels calm. Story 44. At home in the evening. John goes home in the evening. His home is quiet. He sits on the sofa. He rests. He feels calm. He feels safe. Story 45. Before bed. John goes to his bedroom. The room is quiet. He lies down. He closes his eyes. He breathes slowly. He falls asleep. Story 46. Morning tea. John wakes up feeling rested. He makes a cup of tea. The tea smells good. He drinks slowly. He feels calm. He feels peaceful. Story 47. Looking out the window. John stands by the window. He looks outside. He sees the sky. He sees the street. He breathes deeply. He feels relaxed. Story 48. At the park bench. John sits on a bench in the park. The air is cool. He listens to birds. He listens to the wind. He feels calm. He feels peaceful. Story 49. At the garden path. John walks on a garden path. Flowers grow on both sides. He walks slowly. He smiles. He feels relaxed. Story 50. At the quiet cafe. John goes to a quiet cafe. The lights are soft. He orders tea. He sits alone. He drinks slowly. He feels calm. Story 51. At the train platform. John waits for a train. The platform is quiet. He stands calmly. He looks around. He feels peaceful. Story 52. At the library corner. John sits in a quiet corner of the library. He reads a book. He turns pages slowly. He feels relaxed. Story 53. At the river bridge. John stands on a bridge. He looks at the water. The river moves slowly. He feels calm. Story 54. At the hill. John walks up a small hill. The view is beautiful. He sits down. He breathes deeply. He feels peaceful. Story 55. At the old cafe. John visits an old cafe. The chairs are wooden. He orders coffee. He sits quietly. He drinks slowly. He feels calm. Story 56. At the flower garden. John walks in a flower garden. Colors are bright. He smells the flowers. He smiles. He feels relaxed. Story 57. At the stone path. John walks on a stone path. The stones are smooth. He steps carefully. He feels calm. Story 58. At the small bridge. John crosses a small bridge. The water is clear. He stops. He looks down. He feels peaceful. Story 59. At the quiet lake. John sits by a lake. The water is still. He breathes slowly. He feels calm. Story 60. At the field. John walks in a green field. The sky is wide. He walks slowly. He feels relaxed. Story 61. At the forest path. John walks in a forest. Trees are tall. He listens to birds. He feels peaceful. Story 62. At the wooden bench. John sits on a wooden bench. The world is quiet. He closes his eyes. He feels calm. Story 63. At the sunset hill. John watches the sunset. The sky is orange. He breathes deeply. He feels peaceful. Story 64. At the night garden. John walks in a garden at night. The stars are bright. He walks slowly. He feels calm. Story 65. At the balcony. John stands on a balcony. The city is quiet. He looks at the lights. He feels relaxed. Story 66. At the bedroom window. John looks out his bedroom window. The night is calm. He smiles. He feels peaceful. Story 67. At the bed. John lies on his bed. The room is quiet. He closes his eyes. He breathes slowly. He feels calm. Story 68. Before sleep. John relaxes. His body feels light. His mind is quiet. He falls asleep. Story 69. Quiet morning again. John wakes slowly. The room is calm. He sits up. He stretches. He feels peaceful. Story 70. At the breakfast table. John eats breakfast. He drinks tea. He eats slowly. He feels calm. Story 71. At the window again. John looks out the window. The sky is blue. He smiles. He feels relaxed. Story 72. At the garden bench. John sits in the garden. Birds sing softly. He listens. He feels peaceful. Story 73. At the walking path. John walks on a quiet path. The air is cool. He walks slowly. He feels calm. Story 74. At the cafe again. John visits a cafe again. The room is warm. He orders tea. He sits quietly. He drinks slowly. He feels relaxed. Story 75. At the river path. John walks beside a river. The water moves slowly. He listens. He feels peaceful. Story 76. At the small park. John walks in a small park. Trees are green. He sits. He rests. He feels calm. Story 77. At the flower field. John walks in a flower field. Colors are soft. He smiles. He feels peaceful. Story 78. At the quiet street. John walks on a quiet street. The houses are calm. He walks slowly. He feels relaxed. Story 79. At the stone bridge. John crosses a stone bridge. The water flows slowly. He stops. He smiles. He feels calm. Story 80. At the hill again. John walks up a hill again. The view is wide. He sits. He breathes deeply. He feels peaceful. Story 81. At the forest clearing. John stands in a forest clearing. The air is cool. He listens. He feels calm. Story 82. At the quiet room. John sits in a quiet room. The light is soft. He breathes slowly. He feels relaxed. Story 83. At the night sky. John looks at the night sky. Stars shine. He smiles. He feels peaceful. Story 84. At the balcony again. John stands on a balcony. The city is calm. He breathes deeply. He feels relaxed. Story 85. At the bedside. John sits on his bed. The room is quiet. He closes his eyes. He breathes slowly. He feels calm. Story 86. At the pillow. John rests his head. The pillow is soft. He breathes deeply. He feels relaxed. Story 87. At the blanket. John pulls the blanket. The blanket is warm. He smiles. He feels peaceful. Story 88. At the quiet mind. John clears his mind. His thoughts are slow. He breathes slowly. He feels calm. Story 89. At the deep rest. John rests deeply. His body is still. He feels peaceful. Story 90. At the gentle sleep. John sleeps gently. His mind is quiet. He feels safe. Story 91. At the calm night. The night is calm. The world is quiet. John sleeps. Story 92. At the deep sleep. John sleeps deeply. His body is relaxed. His mind is peaceful. Story 93. At the morning window. John stands by the window in the morning. The light is soft and warm. He takes a deep breath. He feels calm and ready. Story 94. At the quiet street corner. John walks to a quiet street corner. Cars move slowly. He stands still for a moment. He feels peaceful. Story 95. At the small bookshop. John goes into a small bookshop. The shop is quiet and warm. He looks at the books. He chooses one and smiles. Story 96. At the coffee table. John sits at a small table. He drinks coffee slowly. He looks around. He feels relaxed. Story 97. At the evening window. John looks out the window in the evening. The sky is dark and calm. He breathes slowly. He feels peaceful. Story 98. At the quiet bedroom. John enters his bedroom. The room is soft and warm. He sits on the bed. He feels safe and calm. Story 99. At the soft pillow. John rests his head on the pillow. The pillow is soft and comfortable. He closes his eyes. He feels relaxed. Story 100. At the gentle sleep. John breathes slowly. His body feels light. His mind is quiet. He sleeps peacefully.